Okay, now I'm going to let people in. You ready?
Ready.
Admit, admit, admit. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, Carolyn.
How are you? How are you? How are you?
Good. How are you, Carolyn?
Oh, just peachy.
Peachy. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah, I went raspberry picking today, so I should say raspberries.
Oh, cool, cool.
Yeah, my goddaughter has a nice backyard. Well, they live out in Lockport and they have a lot of land, so I get to pick every year, and then we get to have a beautiful raspberry pie.
Oh, nice. Very nice. Well, we're just going to wait a few minutes, so have some people come in. Like I always say, Newman time, you know, got to wait a few minutes.
It could be that people are waiting to, pardon me, to see it on YouTube also. I'll tell you myself, Josh, I had to look up all the big words.
I've tried to limit them. I think there are only 2 big words.
Well, Theodicy was the clanger in the beginning.
Yeah.
I figured, well, what's that? You know, I knew it had something to do with God, but I didn't know what it was. And
it's a book title, actually.
Pardon me?
It's a book title. The word is first used in, I think it's an 18th century publication.
Oh, really?
And I think it was actually published in French. So the Anglicanization is like a direct translation from Theodicy.
Well, and then I went from there. I think the rest of the title was tough too. So when you're
hello, everyone. Got a few more people who are joining, and we got some people on Facebook Live too. So just as a reminder, Facebook Live, you are just like a minute or so behind us. So at the end of the lecture, we're going to have it be open to questions or anything. So it might be a little bit of a lag just to get your questions coming in. Just give a few more minutes just for people to come in. And yeah, it's exciting. We're back up and running. We had a little bit of a hiatus. So we got, for the next few weeks, we'll have it consistently. So that'll be exciting.
Oh, good. Good.
Mm-hmm. Very exciting. Oh, got a lot of people on Facebook. Good. Hope everybody's doing well and staying cool. Last week was super hot.
Yeah, and I was outside 4 to 6 hours a day moving perennials, which is not a good time to move perennials either.
No, it does not sound like it.
But we had 3 very large trees taken out, one in our front, and then 2 bigger ones in the back, and then a smaller one. But we're having a fence put up because I'm tired of prison camp Carolyn's garden with deer.
Oh,
you know, with tents and cages and netting, and so we're getting a fence, and half of it's up. But I had to move a lot of stuff or else lose it, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm happy to say that it's all thriving. I've been tending it very solicitously and watering it, you know, thoroughly every day. And so I'm very happy. If only the deer would stop tromping on it and eating the flowers, I'd be very fine.
Oh, jeez.
But they're getting cut out. I had a baby in the yard yesterday. It looked like Bambi, you know. And I thought, and then when I went outside, it was across the street on the lawn, and it looked like a fake lawn fawn, you know. But it was real. They're adorable. They're so adorable. I feel so terrible, but I just I don't do all that work to have them eat it.
All righty. Well, it looks like we got a good amount of people. People will just be coming in throughout, but that's no problem. So hi, everyone. Welcome back. Like I was saying before, we kind of took a few weeks of hiatus, but we're back. The next couple of weeks, we have consistent people, so that will be great. So tonight we have Josh Merlo. Josh is also our campus minister, so that's fun. And it'll be interesting to be able to get to know him and learn more about what he does on the university side too. So I'm going to give him a little intro. Josh is a doctoral candidate in the philosophy department at the University of Buffalo. He previously completed his master's degree in philosophy at both the University of Buffalo and Franciscan University of Steubenville. He works in the areas of history and philosophy of religion. Within philosophy of religion, Josh focuses on the questions about God, creation, and finally, Theodicy. Say that, Josh. Theodicy. We're going to learn about it tonight, so that's good. And that's the topic of his lecture tonight. He's been published in different articles and journals and has presented at multiple different conferences, including Villanova's Patristic, Medieval and Renaissance Studies Conference and the Midwest Society of Christian Philosophy Conference. Oh, cool. Josh has also taught medical ethics and introduction to philosophy for the University of Buffalo, Canisius College, and Damon College. So without further ado, here is Josh.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Just as a brief programming note, I realize that some of the language I'm going to be using tonight could get a little bit technical, and by saying it could get, I mean it probably will be. So if at any point you have questions about some of the words I'm using or need me to explain a topic, you can just go ahead and type out a comment either in Zoom itself, or if you're on Facebook, you can also type a comment there. I think Sarah's going to be monitoring both of those. If you type a comment there, Sarah can then ask me that question. I'll be happy to go back to something if need be, or to further explain a particular concept if that would help all of you viewers out there. So, as Sarah said, I'm Josh Merlo. I work at UB as a professor. I'm also a grad student there, and then I'm a campus minister at the Newman Center. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about that very pesky word, theodicy. I'm going to tell you what theodicy means and also why it matters to Christians. So to frame this lecture tonight, we're going to be looking at the question of why God. To explore this question, I have 4 different sections of my presentation. First, we're going to be looking at the problem of evil, the question of why God lets bad things happen. Second, we're going to be looking at what theodicy is, responding to this question of why God lets bad things happen. Third, we're going to be looking at anti-theodicy. This is going to be objecting to how we try and explain God's letting bad things happen. The final part of this lecture, which is going to be the most philosophical, if you will, we're going to be looking at what I term the cost of theodicy. In other words, we're going to be looking at the problems that are caused by our trying to explain why God lets bad things happen in the world. But to begin with, let's look at the reason theodicy exists in the first place, why it is that we need to try and explain why there's bad stuff in the world, the presence of bad stuff in the world at all. The problem of evil. For each of these 4 sections, I'm going to try and give some concrete examples before we dive into the weeds of philosophical definitions and technical language. So we'll start off with these concrete examples, which I hope will illustrate, will describe these concepts that I have named each of these sections after. So to get at the problem of evil, we're first going to look at the fun year that we've been having in 2020. So, what's been going on this year? What hasn't been going on this year? As all of you well know, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. COVID-19, as according to Johns Hopkins as of yesterday, infected well over 14 million people worldwide, and the death count exceeds 600,000 persons. It should be noted that both of these numbers are widely believed by epidemiological experts to be grossly undercounted. Also during 2020, we saw bushfires devastate wide swaths of land across all of Australia, claiming lives, destroying houses, damaging protected ecosystems, possibly threatening endangered species. We saw a Ukraine International Airlines flight crash just outside of Tehran, killing over 100 people. The world economy has seen lows that are generationally historic, things we haven't seen since the Great Depression in terms of the stock market's collapse, in terms of interest rates being manipulated across the world, currencies being devalued, jobs being lost, unemployment numbers skyrocketing. In Canada, up in Nova Scotia, we saw the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history. In Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, Islamist insurgents executed 52 villagers. In Kabul in Afghanistan, a maternity ward was attacked. Mothers and their newborn children were killed. At the same time, ISIS carried out simultaneous bombings across Afghanistan. In India and Bangladesh, the landfall of Cyclone Amphan led to countless deaths and innumerable property damage. In the US, very recently, I'm sure all of you are aware of the protests that have been going on, demanding a change to the institutions in the US that promote police brutality and systemic racism, demanding justice for murdered Black Americans. In Myanmar, a jade mine collapsed. After heavy rains, there was a mudslide which resulted in the trapping or the deaths of hundreds of miners and workers. With all of these events that occurred, you can ask the following question. How is it that Christian believers, those who believe in both a perfect and a providential God, how is it that these Christians can claim God knows all these horrible things would happen, that God could prevent them from happening, and that God cares about the people affected by them, and yet still have to admit that all of these things happened? The problem of evil is that exact question. If God is perfect, if God is providential, how can all of these evil things happen? Now, to fully understand the ramifications of the problem of evil, we need to better understand some of the terminology that I'm using within that definition. So what do we mean by a perfect God? Now, this is a fairly complicated question. There's a lot of different things we say about God. We say God is like a father. We say God is loving, or he's merciful, or he's forgiving. We say God is free. We say God is powerful. With respect to the question posed by the problem of evil, however, the Christian tradition and also non-Christian thinkers who've addressed this problem tend to focus on three specific attributes of God's: his omniscience, his omnipotence, and his omnibenevolence. In simpler language, God's perfect knowledge, God's perfect power, and God's perfect goodness or perfect care. So when we say God is perfect, when we ask how a perfect God can allow for evil, what we're saying, what we're asking is how a God who knows about bad things, who could stop those bad things, and who cares about the persons affected by those bad things, how such a God can still let them happen. In the same way, when we talk about a providential God, we're talking about a God who has a plan for all of the members of his creation, for all the persons in the world. So in Matthew's gospel, I actually think it occurs in all the synoptic gospels, but in Matthew's gospel, Jesus addresses the crowds who are listening to him preach, and he says, "Why are you worried? Why do you think God doesn't care for you? Look at the birds of the air. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet they always have enough to eat. Look at the lilies of the field. These flowers bloom today and then are thrown into a fire tomorrow, yet they're clothed more magnificently than Solomon. If God cares for birds and for weeds like this, how much more must he care for you, his children?" The idea of a providential God, then, is the idea that God does in fact care for us, and that this care is manifested in an overall plan God has for the world. A plan that will accomplish what is best for that world and for the inhabitants of it. And a plan that, importantly, will always result in the outcome God has in mind. When I say it's an indomitable plan, it's a plan that can't be defeated. Nothing can get in its way. God will always bring about the end that he planned for. So the problem of evil, then, when we say that it questions or challenges the perfection of God, God's providence, what we're saying is it questions how God can have these attributes that Christianity, the Christian tradition, holds that he does, how we can say God has a plan, and then look at things that seem to go against the idea of God being perfect or of God having a plan. So the problem of evil, then, challenges or is an objection to either the combined perfection and providence of God or to the very existence of God himself. So given that there is evil in the world, how do we make sense of it? How do we make sense of the presence of evil and then also the claim that God is existent and perfect and providential? This brings us to theodicy. What is a theodicy? Well, to understand this, we're going to look at another biblical story. Job. I'm guessing many of you know who Job is. Job's described in the Bible, in the book of Job, as being a good guy. He's upright, he's righteous. He has all of those words you want associated with you in the Bible. He's someone who loves God, and God loves him back. Now, in the story of Job, the devil comes to God one day and says, "Hey, God, this Job character, yeah, he loves you, but he has a really sweet life. Bunch of kids who are great kids. He has a huge farm, bunch of cattle. He's really, really wealthy, pretty prominent member of society. He's had good health. He loves you now, God, but take away all that stuff from him and let's see how he reacts." So God says, "I believe in Job. I think Job loves me for the right reasons, but I will let you test him." So Job's family is killed. There's a huge storm, a hailstorm, destroys his fields. There's a whirlwind, kills all of his cattle, kills his birds and his sheep and whatever else he has. The animals aren't specified, so that's slightly creative license. Job has boils break out in his skin. So Job, this loving person, this God-fearing man, is left destitute, without a home, without a family, sitting in rags, his skin festering. God was right about Job, though. Job doesn't turn on God. He continues to believe and he continues to care for God, to worship him, to adore him, to praise him. But importantly, Job also asks God why. The book of Job is described as being particularly beautiful in its use of Hebrew-styled poetry. So in the original, Job is in some ways reciting these poems to God. So in the same way, poets that we're familiar with within the English language will write to express particular strong feelings, the book of Job is written in that same way. So when Job has these long monologues, they're these poetic expressions of his grief and also They're expressions of his inability to understand why God is punishing him, why God is letting him go through this suffering. So Job's question to God of why is him asking God, hey, if you're really just, if you really care about me, and if I've done nothing wrong, why? Why let these things happen to me? Job is asking God for a reason for Job's undeserved suffering. That ask for a reason, or that ask for a reason, I should say, is what theodicy is an attempt to supply. In other words, theodicy is the explanation given for how you can have evil and also a perfect and providential God. On this page, I have a quote from the book of Job. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to read it over yourselves. I want to describe this quote as Job's attempt to make sense of what has happened to him. You'll notice the inquiries, the interrogatives that Job is using. What? Why? 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 This is Job asking the question that sparks theodicy. This is Job saying to God, why is this happening? I know who you are, or at least who you claim to be. I know what I've done, what you've asked me to do, and yet I'm suffering. Why is that, God? So the questions we see Job asking in the 7th chapter of the same book, these questions, why, God? How could you let this happen? Why are you doing this to me? How can this be your plan? What purpose could all this evil have? These are familiar questions. These are the questions prompted by the problem of evil. And these are the questions that theodicies attempt to give an answer to. When we talk about a theodicy, then, we are talking about a response to the problem of evil, an argument that defends God's perfection and his providence. Now, there are different flavors, I'll say, of these arguments. There are different kinds of arguments you can make when you're attempting to do a theodicy, to theodicize. Some of these arguments I've included here, and these are the most prominent, the ones that occur most often. The first attempt one could make at theodicy is simply to say, we can't give an explanation of why there's evil because we don't understand the world as God does. This is actually the explanation we see in the book of Job. So Job multiple times says, God, why are you doing this? And at the end of the book, God himself speaks to Job. And God says, who are you to question the Almighty? Were you there when I made the foundations of the earth? When I set the stars, the heavens, and the sky? Can you, Job, wrestle the behemoth? Can you hook the Leviathan? God's response to Job is one we see in the book of Isaiah. My thoughts are above your thoughts. My ways are above your ways. You, a finite mortal human, can't understand the complexities of the universe made by an infinite, immortal God. So there isn't a reason that's available to you. This is a possible theodicy. It's one I find deeply unsatisfactory. So we're not going to stop here. We're going to push ahead and actually try and find an explanation for what I think are some very strong questions, these ones posed by the problem of evil. So what are some of the ways the Christian tradition has tried to respond to this problem? The most familiar, I would guess, response, and the one that appears most often among the great thinkers we have within the Christian tradition, is that evil occurs because God can bring greater good from it. This is the response given by luminaries like Augustine, like Thomas Aquinas. Evil happens in the world, yes, but God takes from that evil, he makes from that evil a greater good. An easy example of this, say a hurricane happens. Hurricanes are bad. People die, communities are devastated, houses destroyed, belongings lost, infrastructure collapsed. Think of, say, Puerto Rico, what happened there in this past year. But what happens after the hurricane usually? We see neighborhoods banding together to care for people who lost their homes. We see an outpouring of support from people completely unrelated to the area that was affected. We see Red Cross volunteers arriving. We see doctors and nurses from unaffected areas coming in to serve those who were injured. We see money coming in from across the world, donations for survivors. This is the good from evil theodicy. The hurricane was bad, but that badness is supplanted by, is outweighed by all of the good that also results from the hurricane, that follows from the evil that occurred. Another possible theodicy, this is one that's become more popular within the philosophical literature, but also within, I would say, the common discussion of the problem of evil. This is one that's become more popular recently. Alvin Plantinga's a Christian philosopher, 20th century, who popularized this view, but it's one we can also trace back to some of the church fathers. Augustine has a similar attempt at theodicy that follows along these lines. Bad stuff happens in the world because we're free, because we have a will that allows us to act in a way that we're not determined by stuff outside of us or inside of us. Now, while bad stuff happens because of free will, the good that we can do from our free will outweighs it. And moreover, the goodness of us being beings that can freely choose, that can freely decide, that even more balances the scale of good versus evil to good. In other words, the goodness of our freedom and of our ability to do good with that freedom, that is enough to overshadow the badness that also comes from our freedom. In his treatise on the free will, Augustine remarks something along the lines of, "It is better for me to be a free person who acts evilly and is so damned, so sent to hell forever, than for me to simply be a dumb animal, a pig in a trough or a rock." It's better for us to be free and then to use that freedom poorly than to not be free at all. That's how good of a thing freedom is. The final brand or version of theodicy we're going to talk about is one that actually comes from the man who coined the term theodicy. Theodicy comes from the title in French for a small work published in the 18th century by the Prussian philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, Leibniz is probably best known for his philosophical thesis that we live in the best of all possible worlds. What does it mean? Well, in his Theodicy, in this book that Leibniz has published, he's attempting to argue that God is just and perfect, despite the presence of evil in the world. That is, he's trying to do theodicy. Leibniz's argument goes like this. Well, if we know God is perfect, then there has to be an explanation of why there's evil in the world that allows for God to have done the best he could. What is that explanation, Leibniz says? Well, given that God can do anything and knows everything, this is the best world he could have made. God can't improve upon what happens here in any way. Leibniz's theodicy, then, his attempt to respond to the problem of evil, this is the best things could be. God did the very best he could. And that means the proportion of good to evil is the best it could have been, even given a world in which there's no evil, even given a scenario where God doesn't create at all, so there's no good, but also no evil at all. This world is a better proportion of good to evil. So the evil we can explain as being somehow related to making this world so good. That's Leibniz's thesis that this is the best of all possible worlds. So given a few different variations on theodicy, we can see what people who theodicize, what they're doing is challenging either the accuracy of or the reasonableness of the objections that come from the problem of evil. That is, they're trying to say, people who say the problem of evil is bad for God's being perfect or providential, either are wrong, or they're making an objection that doesn't really make sense. And then they try and show you why that's the case. Of course, there's another element of theodicies I need to mention. That is that people who are making these attempts at explaining why there's evil in the world despite God's perfection very often will redefine what is meant by God's perfection, will redefine what it means for him to be omniscient or omnipotent or omnibenevolent, and will redefine what it means for God to have a plan. We'll come back to that later. It's important. But for now, that's what a theodicy is. So at this point, I'm just going to ask Sarah, are there any questions in the comments? Are we good?
You're doing good, Josh. No questions so far, it looks like. If they do, feel free to send them in.
So as a philosophy professor, I know this means one of two things. Either I've done an incredible, amazing, unsurpassable job at explaining things to you, or I've confused you so much you actually don't know what to ask a question about. Really hoping it's the first one. Let's move on from theodicy, though. And if you do have questions, you don't want to ask them now, you can save them for the Q&A at the end. I want to talk about anti-theodicy. Now, anti-theodicy works like you might expect it to, like any other word that you stick anti in front of. It's an attempt to push back against a theodicy. So the example for anti-theodicy is one that's important, but I also realize is a somewhat uncomfortable, is a somewhat too relevant example. The ongoing crisis in the Catholic Church with sex abuse. So 2 years ago, Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General for Pennsylvania, presented the findings of a 2-year-long grand jury investigation into 6 separate Catholic dioceses in Pennsylvania. This report detailed allegations of abuse for 70 years. And the grand jury found that within these 6 dioceses, 300-odd priests had abused over 1,000 persons in that 70-year time period. The grand jury also estimated that there were thousands of others of persons whose abuse was not confirmable from the evidence that was available to them. I have here a statement from the introduction to the grand jury report. For any of you who read it, I was able to only read some of it myself, but for any of you who read it, you know that it accounts unspeakable atrocities. I'm not going to run through all of the examples that were included, but I do want to at least mention this. So again, from the introduction of the report, most of the victims were boys, but there were girls too. Some were teens and many were prepubescent. Some were manipulated with alcohol or pornography. Some were made to masturbate their assailants or were groped by them. Some were raped orally, some vaginally, some anally. But all of them were brushed aside by church leaders who preferred to protect their abusers and their institution above all. Why do I bring this up? Well, one, because I think it's something that as a church we still need to fully reckon with. We need to be aware of and we need to take action about. But beyond that, relevant to our discussion now, we need to ask ourselves, if we're going to make an explanation of the problem of evil and say something like, well, God brings good out of any evil, or God planned for the evil in such a way that it leads to something better eventually, or God knew this would happen but accepted it because freedom is such a great thing to have. If we're going to try and explain away evil in this manner, we need to ask ourselves if we are willing for the price of this better future, the price of these goods that follow evil, the price of our freedom, to be, say, the sexual abuse of a child, to be, say, a genocide, to be millions of people infected with a disease that has fairly severe consequences, to be tens to hundreds of thousands of people every year who die because of lack of access to clean water or nutritional food. I can keep listing these examples. I chose one that I realize is fairly, well, it's going to be fairly effective in that it's going to spark strong emotional responses in us to illustrate what the challenge of anti-theodicy really is. We're trying to say there's a reason for the badness. We have to realize that that reason has attached to it a figurative price tag, and that that price is going to be possibly unjustifiably high. If you want to say there is a reason for all of the horrible things that were detailed in that grand jury report, are you really willing to say that that reason is good enough to justify all those unspeakable horrors? This is what anti-theodicy is. It's an objection or a response to the process of theodicy, to attempting to explain why there's evil in the world despite God's perfection. And it challenges either the accuracy of or the moral permissibility of theodicy itself. Now, like with theodicies, where we saw there were multiple different ways of trying to explain the presence of evil in the world despite God's perfection, there are multiple different manners of approaching this anti-theodicy, of approaching this process of saying theodicies don't work. Some of these anti-theodicies, one could make the claim that theodicies are too insensitive to suffering. This was the example I was just presenting. Given the impact of these evil events, of these really bad things on persons, how can we fail to appreciate that negative impact, that disvalue? How can we glance over it, ignore it, or say, well, things are better overall? How can we say the suffering of those individuals is not just as important as the goods that will benefit other individuals? Relatedly, one can also claim that theodicies make use of the wrong moral system. I'm guessing all of you have heard some variation of the phrase, the ends don't justify the means, like the anti-Machiavellian dictate. Within Christian moral theology, you will find that many persons who talk about morality will hold that the ends, in fact, do not justify the means. You can't do a bad thing just because it results in good things. In philosophy, we have a name for moral systems that say you can do bad stuff to bring about good stuff. We call them consequentialist. That is, we say that within these systems, what is morally important are the consequences of actions, the outcomes of actions, not the actions themselves. A way to do anti-theodicy, to say that theodicies are bad, is to claim that theodicies are consequentialist. Theodicies use the wrong moral system and assume the means do justify the ends, or sorry, the ends do justify the means. One could also anti-theodicize, if that's a word, by saying that theodicies ignore the value of persons. In the same way we can say that theodicies are too callous about the suffering of persons, we could also say that theodicies too easily, too readily allow for persons to be treated simply as tools in the accomplishing of some greater purpose. To put this bluntly, one could say God uses people to benefit other people. Some persons are just cogs in the overall plan, the overall machine that spits out a good world. Remember when I said when we were talking about theodicy that we needed to remember that some people who theodicize will redefine God's perfection or his providence? We're coming back to that here. Another possible anti-theodicy is to claim that people who do theodicy misunderstand the divine nature. They misunderstand what God's actually like. To put this plainly, if you're going to tell me God does horrible stuff, or at least allows horrible stuff to happen because he wants to bring about a better world, you don't understand what it means for God to be merciful, for God to be forgiving, for God to be loving, for God to be like the father who prodigally gives to his children. You don't understand what God is like if you're going to tell me, oh yeah, God's exactly like you think he is, and also does all this bad stuff. A final version of anti-theodicy is one that should be familiar, because we actually saw it when we were talking about versions of theodicy. One could simply claim theodicies are wrong-headed, if you will, because they try and explain something that's inexplicable. They try to give a reason to something that we can't reason about. It's the same line we had before: we're mortal, we're finite, God's not, so we can't know what God's up to. So another way of doing anti-theodicy is simply to say it's impossible to do because we're trying to say something about a thing we cannot comprehend. So anti-theodicies then reject either the possibility of explaining how God can be perfect and there be evil in the world, or they reject that this attempt at explaining those two things is successful. We're now moving into what I want to call the properly philosophical part of this lecture. What we've been doing so far has been laying the groundwork, building a foundation for our discussion. We're now actually going to enter into the philosophical part of the discussion. To do so, we're going to be talking about what I'm calling the cost of theodicy. That's Dr. Gregory House. He's the main character on a TV show some of you have probably seen, a TV show that I really, really love. We can see House here in GIF form telling us that either God doesn't exist or he's unimaginably cruel. This is taken from a particular episode of House in which he spends the episode interacting with a patient. The patient in the episode is raped, and she's trying to make sense of it within a Christian worldview. House, for those of you who haven't seen the show, is very much hostile to a Christian worldview. But the claim that he's making here, I think, is one that Christians have to take seriously. House is saying there is a philosophical dilemma that is an either-or statement presented by the presence of evil in the world. That either things in the world don't make sense, or the God that makes them make sense, that plans for them, is cruel. This is what I'm going to say the cost of theodicy is. We either must say we resolve the dilemma by admitting stuff in the world doesn't make sense, we can't explain it, or by admitting we might have been very, very wrong about what it means for God to be omnibenevolent, for God to be loving, for God to be providential. To talk about theodicy is to see a social phenomenon that is unsurprising. Discussions of the problem of evil and theodicy usually break along what I'm going to call philosophical party lines. That is to say, if you're non-religious, you're going to stress the problem of evil. You're going to talk about how the presence of evil in the world means there's either not a God or he's not perfect. And if you're religious, you're going to stress that the problem of evil can be responded to, that theodicy is doable, that we can say, here's why there's evil, and here's how we can still understand God to be perfect. God to be all-loving, God to be providential despite the presence of that evil. I want to break us away from this across the aisles back and forth. I want to say that what matters within this discussion is not just the problem of evil, is not just responding to it, but rather the question of anti-theodicy. If we grant that theodicy is possible, that we can respond to this question of how God allows for the evils we see in the world. If we grant also that theodicy is not just possible, but there is in fact an explanation that works, that aligns with how the world is, we still have to answer as to the price, the cost of that explanation. What must we concede in giving a reasonable response to the problem of evil? That is to say that the Christian response to the problem of evil, the attempt at theodicy, this giving of explanations of bad things in the world, this answering of the question of why God, it neglects the important problem posed by anti-theodicy. That in some way, a Christian who holds to one of the theodicies we discussed, who holds that one of these explanations is in fact true, has to admit that in some sense there are acceptable losses for God. That in some sense, God is connected to, is part of this causal chain of bad stuff happening into the world to his children that he loves. The discussion of theodicy, I in fact want to claim, hinges upon our dealing with, our grappling with anti-theodicy. That is, Christians need to not just focus on giving an explanation, but Christians need to focus on saying whether or not that explanation is justifiable. I had a professor back at Steubenville when I was working in my undergrad studies and also as a graduate student. Roberts, he was from New England, very thick accents. Those of you who have heard me talk about my philosophical career before will have heard me talk about Roberts, but I'm going to talk about him anyway. He loved posing to us very thorny issues, especially within Christian philosophy, backing us into a wall and then telling us there was no way to fix the problem, and then leaving us deflated, confused, dejected, and smirking and walking out of the classroom to go make himself a gimlet at home after class. But Roberts did this for a reason. He once told us in class that he thought most philosophers don't actually do philosophy. A lot of people who do philosophy, Roberts said, they just do history work. Well, Aristotle lived at this time and he said these things. I mean, yeah, but that's no different from saying, like, Napoleon lived at this time. Martin Luther King Jr. did these things. That's just history. And then a lot of people who say they do philosophy, well, they're just doing interpretive work. Thomas Aquinas, we can understand from this part of the Summa Theologiae, meant this thing in the Summa Contra Gentiles. That's valuable work in understanding a particular philosopher, but you're not actually interacting with the claims Thomas makes. You're not trying to show whether or not they work. You're just saying this is how we should understand Thomas. There are other ways in which people don't do philosophy, but Roberts said the rarity, the minority of these persons do real philosophy. And that, he said with one of his trademark Cheshire cat grins, is to interact with the struggle, he called it. When I said earlier we need to grapple with this problem of anti-theodicy, what I was saying is, in effect, Christians need to struggle with that dilemma that House posed to us earlier. Responding to the problem of evil isn't just about saying, hey guys, I came up with an explanation and it makes sense. I mean, that's good. You should try and come up with an explanation that makes sense. Nonsensical explanations aren't really explanations, but that doesn't mean your explanation is good. To do real philosophical work with theodicy is to ask ourselves if we can really be okay with saying, here's how I solve the problem. It requires me to admit to this cost of innocent suffering, of unmerited, unjustified suffering, of gratuitous evil. if you're going to try and respond to the problem of evil, either you have to say, the world's chaotic, there's evil and we can't make sense of it, or there's a God who is willing to make use of this evil to allow for some persons to be sacrificed, to be disvalued, for the sake of other persons, for the sake of the wider world. What I'm arguing then is that theodicy cannot be divorced from the objection of anti-theodicy. That this problem of persons being instrumentalized, being used, this problem of there being horrific, terrible, unimaginable, unconscionable suffering in the world being tied into the divine plan, that needs to be responded to just as much as the problem of evil. In other words, what I'm saying we need to do, if you are going to theodicize, you also need to provide, I'll call it, a theodicy for your theodicy. You can't just respond to the problem of evil. Answering the question of why God also requires you to explain why your explanation is better than no explanation at all. Why it is okay to say God uses the suffering of some persons. Why it is okay to admit that the divine plan may be the best for everyone overall, but will end up being the worst for some particular persons included in that plan. To answer the question, why God, you must also answer the question of how it is just, it is right, it is allowable, it is permissible for the means that different theodicies utilize to be attributed to a perfect God, for a perfect God to allow for evil. That's the question. Embed it in the attempt to respond to why God? And that's the question I think there is real philosophical value in both addressing and attempting to answer. Thank you all for coming today, for listening. And if you have any questions now, I think Sarah has something to say about how we'll be going over this.
Yeah. First of all, very nice, very nice. We'll be taking questions now. If you're watching on Facebook, feel free to type them in. If you're here with us on Zoom, you can send your questions to the chat, or you can just unmute yourself. We do have one question already in the chat. It's from Ryan. Are there explanations of, I still don't know the word, theodicy? Theodicy? You just had a whole talk about theodicy. That account for the existence of Satan or the devil as an independent actor or force in the world?
So that's a really good question, Ryan. When you look at theodicy, you actually find out that humans are kind of unimportant. Now, granted, what I am telling you right now is not going to be acceptable to a bunch of different people in the Christian tradition. You're going to have disagreements between Protestant versus Catholic theologians. You're going to have disagreements among Catholic theologians. You're going to have historical disagreements. All of that is just sort of a preface to say, like, people disagree with me. This shouldn't be surprising. No one agrees with anyone in philosophy. Okay, so what did I mean by saying humans are kind of unimportant? Well, first of all, angels are like God. They exist perpetually. That is, they exist without end. And they existed, under some theological accounts, before like the creation of a physical world, which means the fall of the angels seems to have, I'll call it, causal primacy, which is a fancy way of saying it came before the fall of humanity. Given that, well, it seems like evil being in the world is explicable by having these fallen angels, by having these agents who want bad stuff to happen and try and make people do bad stuff. Milton is not exactly an excellent theological resource. Like, he managed to be a heretic in literally every possible Christian religion of his time period, but Milton helps to really illustrate this point, to describe this point for us, where Milton has Satan leaving hell to mess with Eden, to tempt Adam and Eve, because Milton wants to introduce, or sorry, not Milton, Satan in Milton's description wants to introduce evil in the perfect Eden. He wants to mess up God's plan. So, like, Milton gives us a clear picture of there being a primacy to the fall of the angels compared to the fall of humanity. But to address the rest of your question, what does this have to do with theodicy? Well, it seems like there could be a loophole of some sorts here. Well, if it's the fault of the fallen angels that there's evil in the world, like, then it's not God's fault. God doesn't bear responsibility. This is a similar argument to the theodicy that has to do with free will. It's not God's fault when we misuse free will. Well, in one sense, it's true. It's not like God is a marionette. Wait, no, that's a puppet. The puppeteer, the person playing with the marionette up in heaven. It's not like God, like, takes my hand and has me slap somebody. Unless you're Mel Branch, then God kind of does that, but he's weird, so we're not going to talk about it. But remember, God's perfect. God knew the angels would fall. God could have made a world in which the angels didn't fall, or the angels didn't succeed in tricking humanity, into tempting humanity. And God presumably cares about humans and angels enough that he wouldn't want them to be damned. He wouldn't want them to sin. So, well, it seems like the presence of the angels, or the presence of really any free agents, helps skirt God's responsibility. We still then have to address God's perfection and how it's related to this question. Because if God does indeed make a world in which all this stuff happens, and he knew it could have happened, and he could have not made it happen, prevented it from happening, and he cares about its happening, God does then bear some responsibility. So in the same way, I think it was Alfred Nobel, guy the Nobel Prizes are named after, guy who invented dynamite, which is why he wanted to support, like, the Nobel Prizes. In the same way, he felt a crippling sense of guilt for the use of the chemical compound he made as a weapon of war. What I'm claiming is that there's that same sense of responsibility. No, God didn't light the stick of dynamite, but he made the dynamite in the first place.
Okay, no questions so far on Facebook, lots of comments. Jan Schneider said, thank you very much. Arlene says, thanks for a wonderful lecture. You teach very well. I'm grateful for all you have given me to think about. And Anne McGurk said, lots to digest, a powerful presentation. Thank you very much. And Father Pat said, wow, what a great talk. Thank you. Is there anybody else on either Facebook, or if you're here on Zoom, if you want to type out a question, or you can just unmute yourself, feel free to.
Go ahead, Carolyn, if you had a question.
There we go. I think one of the things that I see or think about a lot, especially lately with all this going on in the world, is, and help me with this, is nobody wants to mention that there is sin in the world. You know, I mean, people are ignorant, or they don't have enough education, or it's socioeconomical or something like that. But it's not fashionable to even recognize evil and sin. And so I think when you think about it, evil is trying to explain it and so on. It's one of the, you know, it's almost like we want to overcome it, but we can't. It's impossible. Because, you know, if you go back to the Christian, you know, the Bible, Jesus said that the world has been given to Satan, you know, it belongs to him. So yeah, we got to try to overcome it, but how do we do that if we don't even admit what the problem is? So anyway, maybe you can expand a little on that.
Sure. Thanks, Carolyn.
You know, just quoting Job, you know, I just love that final response from Job, and it's one of my favorite scriptures. It's chapter 42, when he answers the Lord after all the arguments. Basically we all have to repent in dust and ashes, and that's not modern either. So I think we have a real problem here.
The reality of sin, it matters in two ways. And I really hope I'm not going to forget the two ways, because I do that sometimes. I'll give a number and then won't remember all the things. But I think it matters in two ways. One, because it's really, really easy to be very abstract when we're talking about something like the problem of evil, something like theodicy. It's really easy to just think of God as like some sort of divine accountant. So God's, looking at the blueprints for different worlds, and he has his calculator and typing out, well, let's see, this world, there's negative 637 evil there because the mammoths all go extinct. But in this world, there's negative 748 because slavery exists. And then in this world over here, there's only -2 because the worst thing that happens is mosquito bites itch a little bit more. So it's really easy to just treat evil abstractly. Like there's this comparison, and there's units of good and units of evil, and they balance each other out. I think that's why it's important to recognize like the challenge of anti-theodicy. Because what it's really saying is, for a second, stop just looking at this as a problem to be solved and realize that this problem is personified. You're not just talking about evil in the world. You're talking about a person being harmed. You're talking about someone's life being negatively changed, maybe for its duration. You're not just talking about evils removedly, aloofly, or you shouldn't be. And I think introducing a discussion of the reality of sin, the reality of evil, it matters because it makes it much harder then to ignore the fact that it really matters for Christians that bad stuff happens. It matters for us that there's a pandemic and that people are dying and getting sick. It matters for us that there is racism embedded in our society. It matters for us that as Christians, we aren't properly responding to the gospel challenges. We're not properly responding to each other as children of God. That's important, and it's not just something we should try to explain away. Now, I said I was hoping I wouldn't forget the second thing, but I did forget the second thing. But overall, I think the point I want to make is that anti-theodicy as like a philosophical concept, it's telling us to admit that some stuff is bad and that some bad stuff is really, really bad. And that if we don't appreciate that, we're doing a disservice to the persons, to any entities really that have to suffer through that badness. So I think that's part of that struggle I was talking about at the end. If you're going to give an explanation, your explanation better appreciate I'm going to say a phenomenological, I'll explain what that word means. In a phenomenological way, evil, the presence of evil. Phenomenology is a school of philosophy which basically tells us to pay attention to our experiences. So when I say we need to appreciate the phenomenological reality of evil, what I'm saying is suffering, it's not conceptual. Suffering isn't cognitive in the sense that it's like a wee little idea that I can plug into arguments. Suffering is felt, it's effective. We need to realize that when people suffer, that's not just something we can write off. That's not just something we can stick into our equation to determine proportion of good to evil. We have to understand what that suffering is. We have to understand how very tangible evil is sometimes. If we don't look at evil, if we don't call it evil, and if we don't realize what evil does to people, we're kind of missing the whole point of doing theodicy. We're kind of missing the whole point of trying to make sense of evil in a world that God has some kind of sovereignty over, kind of missing the sense of like the whole gospel and Christianity thing too, if we're just willing to ignore evil and how it affects people. So yeah, summarized version, evil matters, and recognizing it as evil matters as well.
It's all,
Sorry, I was on
what
mute.
you're saying is that we need evil. Evil is necessary in the world to better the world. It's God needs evil.
So I'm going
So
to
he can
be
look
careful
good.
how I answer that, but I want to say we need to appreciate evil when we're trying to do work like Theodicy. I will also say that many people who try and give this explanation will end up having to give you a version of the statement, evil is a needed part, a necessary part of God's plan. But there's a lot of theological arguments about that, and theologians get very mad at you when you say things like that.
Well, thank you.
Sorry. Mike says, it's the price of having free will. From his view, just like you can't have a top without a bottom, you wouldn't be able to see good without also knowing and being able to see evil.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting point. It's another version of theodicy I didn't mention, but yeah, one could make the argument that we can appreciate good without seeing its opposite, without seeing evil. Like, it's really, really hard for me to understand, for instance, it's really, really hard for me to understand what like a cube is if I just show you like an empty space and then give you the geometrical definition of it. But I can show you a sphere and be like, not that. You're like, why? Well, it's not rounded. Okay, I know what not round means. And it has like right angles. I know what a right angle means. And it like binds a certain dimension in this way. Oh, okay, I know what that means. So maybe if we're really good at math, you could figure out what a cube is from the equation that defines a cube. Most people are going to need like that visual element, that image, to better figure out what a cube is. So you could make the argument that we need this contrast to get what good is, or to more fully appreciate, more fully apprehend, more fully be grateful for what good is. I still want to say there is this anti-theodicy problem there. But that is very much going to be a way to attempt to say like why it is we need to have evil in the first place. And one could also make the claim that we don't recognize why it matters so much that we bring about good, that we try and right wrongs, if we can't first recognize how bad those wrongs are. It's a slightly different argument. And that might be a more promising way of addressing this anti-theodicy problem. If we could say that we have to see how really bad these evils are to get why we should be bringing about good.
All right. Well, we got some time left, but as we start to wrap up, I just want to say thank you to Josh. Thank you. Did a wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. That's been the overall takeaway, is lots to digest. So that's fun and everything. So thank you so much for that. Oh, we have another question. Excellent. Oh man, there's a lot of big words in this. Okay. Is theodicy a consequence of an anthropomorphized God, an avuncular graybeard on a throne in orbit somewhere out there? If one adopts Tillich's definition of God as the ground of all being, good and evil aren't allowed by God, but rather a consequence of the actions of the world and its inhabitants.
There is a lot going on there. So first, sorry, I'm thinking through what I want to say about that. Actually, let's just jump to the end part. So good and evil somehow being consequences of the world. When I said earlier that oftentimes theodicy or people doing theodicy will attempt to redefine how we should understand God's attributes. This particular definition seems to be doing that. One of the problems with redefining divine attributes, or actually I should say a couple of the problems, are thus. One, if we're trying to maintain orthodoxy in some sense, there are going to be doctrinal definitions within the church that rule out particular forms of theodicy. So for instance, if we were to say something like God is the, forgive me for the technical language, ontological foundation of good and evil, which is in some senses accurate, but regardless, in other words, God is where they come from, is the source of them, that's something that the church just isn't going to allow us to say. For various reasons, there is the heresy of Manichaeanism. This is circa Augustine, so very early church, first centuries of the church, which claimed that good and evil both existed as things and there were entities responsible for them, and that they sort of combated with each other, and that's why there's evil in the world, just because there was this fundamental source of it. Ignoring, though, the theological problems, if we want to say that there's just some sort of like necessary structure of the world that leads to evil being present along with good, if we want to say there's some sort of determinism that leads to this, well, that seems to take away then from the perfection of God, which is the entire reason that we try and do theodicy in the first place. If we're going to grant that God can't break out of this cycle of evil coming, or God didn't know it was going to happen, which is why he made this world, or if God's just like, yeah, there's evil there, but it doesn't really matter to me. If we're going to say that, we're no longer granting God is omniscient or omnibenevolent or omnipotent. So if we want to redefine what we understand God or the divine attributes to be, we can do that. But some of these definitions are actually going to preclude theodicy. They're going to prevent us from defending the picture of God we had in the first place. So, summary then, there are theological worries with that kind of definition, with that kind of response. Beyond the theological worries about just like being dogmatically correct, there are also worries that we're kind of undermining the process of theodicy if we're just going to throw up our hands and say, well, yeah, God's not perfect, which explains why there's evil. Yeah, but you were trying to explain why there was evil and God was perfect. As another example of this, process theology is something that is fairly prominent among English-speaking theologians. I almost said William Jennings Bryant. That is not the right person. Very different person in American history. William Lane Craig is probably among the most famous, if not the most famous, process theologian. What do process theologians argue? They argue that God exists in some ways like us. That is, he's part of time. God wanders around the world like we do. He's just kind of like Superman. Really, really powerful, does everything better than us. But he's still part of the timeline. He's still happen. So for the process theologians, the problem of evil isn't a problem. Because God is a temporal creature, he finds out about things as they happen. He didn't know they were going to happen beforehand, so we can't get mad at him for not preventing them. But the process theologian then is granting God's not omniscient. They're saying we can't fix this problem for traditional Christianity because we think traditional Christianity is wrong about God. You can do that as a solution to the problem of evil, but then it seems like we're not talking about a perfect God anymore, which is problematic for different ways. That was just an example of some of the worries that could be offered to an attempt to redefine outside of this like Christian tradition's understanding of God, to redefine the divine attributes. I want to shortly offer, though, an important caveat about everything that's been said. In philosophy, there are no good solutions. There are just less bad solutions, which is simply to say, every solution to any problem you come up with will have its own problems. This is what we saw with theodicy. Anti-Theodicy is just the recognizing that theodicies are imperfect. So when doing philosophy, what your job is, it's not to identify the perfect solution, doesn't exist. is to identify which solution has the least worst problems. So my saying that like redefining divine attributes is bad, yeah, but also me maintaining the classical God and being like, well, I guess it just turns out that God kind of doesn't like you, so sucks for you, but good for everybody else. Like, that's not really good either. That's bad. I just think that's less bad than saying God isn't actually perfect. But there's room for reasonable dispute for someone to say, no, it's a lot worse for God to be callous and capricious and cruel. I would rather just have a God who isn't perfect in the sense that we've already defined. So yeah, philosophy is hard and it doesn't work. So we just have to decide like which things don't work the least amount.
Very nice. One more question. Doesn't Christ's role in God's arc for the world, redeeming a fallen humankind, render theodicy moot in a roundabout way? Like evil has to exist as a condition for redemption to occur.
That is an excellent point. So if you've ever been to an Easter Vigil Mass, you know there's that really long song that's sung about the candle, the Exalted, the celebration of the Easter mystery, celebration of the end of the Paschal mystery and of the resurrection. In that, there's a Latin phrase that is used, felix culpa, which translates as happy sin. So in the Exalted, the happy sin of Adam, what are we saying? That sin that bought for us so great a Redeemer. It was good that Adam sinned, that humanity fell, because the incarnation happened because of that. So yeah, the incarnation presents a very interesting twist to the question of theodicy. If you don't have evil in the world, God doesn't come in the world. God is infinitely good, so like that totally shifts the balance entirely, right? Leibniz actually, after he publishes his Theodicy, releases what he calls the abridgment of the Theodicy in syllogistic form, which is Leibniz just giving you logical arguments about how he thinks his Theodicy works. And one of the points that Leibniz brings up is this felix culpa argument. That is, Leibniz will say, if we want to talk about the proportion or the balance of good and evil, God becoming man, God being in the world, the infinity of God coming among us, that outweighs everything. So when we're talking about the incarnation, here we no longer seem to have a problem with the balancing of good and evil, unless the amount of evil in the world is also infinite. So this again is a contentious point, but if you look at, say, Athanasius, another one of the church fathers, his small little treatise on why God became man, Athanasius argues the incarnation is necessary because the badness in the world, the badness that results from sin, is in fact infinite. So Athanasius makes this argument. We were in debt to God. That is, we owed God being better than we were. We fell short of that, so we incurred then a debt. And the only thing that could satisfy this debt is one of us. But none of us are in ourselves able to satisfy the debt because of how big it is. So the only thing that could then would be an infinitely good being who is also a human. So Athanasius' argument then, Jesus becomes a human because only God himself could make up for all the bad stuff that we did. So that's one way of looking at this incarnation point. The other way of looking at it is going back to this phenomenological appreciation I've been talking about, like us being able to recognize the awfulness of evil, which is to say, yes, the incarnation may completely outproportion, overbalance our scale to the side of good. That doesn't mean that the suffering of any one individual stops mattering. It still looks like, even if we make the argument, Jesus makes up for all the bad and then some, it still looks like we're saying, well, yeah, I'm sorry, random person who lived in medieval Europe, who died in agony from the bubonic plague, like, it's really bad for you. I feel bad for you, but also, like, take heart. Because of you, this really good thing happens. That looks like the whole using bad means to get a good end thing. Using individuals not as persons, but as tools to bring about something good. So even if the incarnation does, and I think within a Christian perspective, you have to admit it does, give us this good proportion of good to evil, the best proportion. This is why Leibniz makes reference to it. Remember, he wanted a world with proportionately the most good to evil. Well, having the incarnation kind of does that for you. Infinity is always bigger than not infinity. Even if we're going to say that, we still then are pushed into admitting, yeah, God used the bad stuff. God let the bad stuff happen. Or even more so, God caused, in some sense, the bad stuff to happen to bring about the really, really good thing that was the incarnation. That's the worry, at least.
All right. Well, this has been a very engaging and thought-provoking talk. I think we've kind of run our time on this a little bit. I just want to say once again, thank you, Josh. Very interesting. And then I just wanted to remind people, we are, for those of you who don't know, we are having our annual chicken barbecue this year still. It's just going to be a Zoom barbecue instead of staying with auction items and everything. We're just having a drive-through where you come and pick up. You could purchase your tickets online at the Newman Center on our website. And we're also selling tickets in person on Thursdays and Fridays from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So this week, oh my gosh, tomorrow and Friday, and next week, tomorrow and Friday. The barbecue is on August 9th. So make sure you come, and it's from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. And then just as a preview for next week, we will be having another Bridge Lecture series, so make sure you come on back. Bert Gambini will be giving the talk next week. He is a news content manager for the Department of Arts, Humanities, and for social work. Some of you may know Bert as he was the host of Western New York's local culinary competition for all 10 seasons of the show. He's an avid cook. He's a journalist, so I'm sure whatever talk he will bring will be very interesting. So tune in next week at 7 p.m. for that. And then the week after is the much anticipated Father Pat Bridge Lecture. It's been 2 years. It's happening. He can't get out of it this time. So we look forward to that. Thank you again so much for coming and having thought-provoking discussions and questions with us. We hope you're doing well. If you need anything, please reach out to us. And as Father Pat always says, be prayerful and be careful. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Bye.
Josh, go have your gimlet.
Roses, lime juice, and I think it was, I don't remember the gin that he always used. He had a specific one he told us to.
Tanqueray?
No, it was like, I want to say it was Bull or Boar.